It's a beautiful day out there. Time to explore. Sometimes you just get lucky when you're out there boondocking. Maldy sits down, finds places that may be of interest to go visit and maybe turn out to be disappointing. So recently on our trip to the Gila Wilderness, she found a place called the Mimbres Cultural Heritage Center. It is only open on Saturdays. It seemed to be a little museum worth going to. So we decided to take the trip about 15 miles down the road from where we're boondocking and check it out. So we get there an hour early, we take a little trail, check out the place. I have another video about the actual cultural center that I'll be making, and if I remember, I'll link it to this video. But this is going to be an unusual video for me, because I usually just like to 10, 20 minutes, somewhere in that window, so I don't bore people. But we go inside the actual museum, introduce ourselves. Hi, I'm Gene, Melody, and the volunteer working there, his name was Bill, and he decided to start showing us around. He takes us into the first room. Now, you have to understand, they do tours at 1 o'clock every day. We're there at 11 o'clock, so we weren't expecting a tour. So, talk about a person that has passion for their job and really wants to share his knowledge with people. Basically, when he went inside, he said, "My name's Bill," and he did not stop talking for the next 40 minutes. He takes us into one room, and he just tells everything you wanted to know about the Mimbres culture. And luckily, I just grabbed I said, "Can you hang on a second? Do you mind if I film this?" And he said, "No, go ahead." So I started filming. Didn't have time to set up a microphone, just standing there holding my gimbal, trying to hold it as steady as possible. But I thought it was just such an educational experience. As I said, it's not my type of video that I usually put on this channel, but for anybody who's interested in learning about the culture of a Native American group, I just want to do up this video and share it with y'all. Hope you enjoy watching.
After 550, they moved down off of the high hills to this level, to the first bench above the river, which at that time would have probably been about 10 or 15 feet above river level. And the Georgetown phase pit houses got larger. They were still circular. They added an entry ramp that was covered over, so I describe it as looking like a big mud igloo. And their pottery, they started to do some decorative elements. They would add some applique trim around the rim, and sometimes they would paint on a red slip. And then at about 650 to 750, we entered the San Francisco phase, and the pit houses got deeper, more rectangular, but they still had rounded corners. And their pottery, they started to polish that red slip. Another decorative element that was widely used during that time is while the clay was still soft and wet, they would use a blunt stick or sometimes their finger and just punch a lot of little dimples in the pot before they slipped it and polished it. So I described that as looking like big red golf balls. And someone pointed out to me, because they began to polish the pottery and it became more shiny and also slipperier, that those dimples may have added an extra grip possibility. This is the point where they really began to diverge from the rest of the Mogollons here in the Mimbres. They started occasionally to do burials under the floors of the rooms. Other cultures buried their dead under the floors. but usually of abandoned rooms. Like up at Chaco, they would take down the walls to an abandoned room, go in, take up the floor, do the burial, repair the floor, repair the wall. It's a sealed mausoleum. But here, Grandma's right under your feet. She's not moving. And then more radical change during that three-circle phase between 750 and 1000. They stopped using the red slip and started painting with the white slip and using a black paint. Archaeologists refer to that as the boldface era because the lines were thick, done with a thick brush. They were using geometric designs, squares, rectangles, spirals, etc. All done with this thick wavy line. Some people think that the wavy line was meant, it was done intentionally as representing the water, but we don't know for sure. And during that time period, they also started leaving some of the coils unsmoothed. All of this pottery is done with the coil and scrape method. They build up a series of coils and then they scrape it smooth inside and out. But they started at this point of leaving some of the coils on the outside unsmoothed. In fact, they would, some archaeologists who really study the pottery are able to determine different potters by the way that they sort of tweaked those coils together, creating their own unique patterns. And they actually became a design element. During that time, they built the pit houses even deeper. The rectangular rooms became very sharp angled corners. They began to build masonry walls inside the pit that they had dug using river cobbles and adobe mud. They often would wall up in front of the entry ramp that had been there and started using a hatch in the roof as a means of entry. During that time period, they built a great kiva here. When you were out on the trail, you saw where the Great Kiva was, that big depression.
Yeah.
The Great Kiva here was 20 by 25 feet and about 10 feet deep. So if you look around this room, imagine digging this hole, the size of this room, using nothing but sticks in a basket and your bare hands. And then they put masonry walls up. They had a 15-foot long entry ramp. And from floor to ceiling, we estimate was probably about 15 feet. Because the hole was 10 feet deep, this depth, and then it was built up above that. Sometime, well, it was built sometime in the late 800s, early 900s. But then, right around 1000, something radically changed in their culture. They went in, they left ceremonial objects, knocked down all of the support posts that held up the roof, set all of the wood on fire, all of the vegas, latias, support posts. When the fire was out, they pushed in the masonry walls and filled the entry ramp. They stopped building pit houses to live in at that point and started building the above ground structures. They stopped holding their ceremonies in great kivas and held their ceremonies in the plazas. Their ceremonies, we think, changed radically. We're not sure why. whether it was some charismatic Mimbreno who brought influences back from elsewhere, or whether it was some charismatic figure that came in from elsewhere and said, "You're doing it all wrong. This is the way you have to do it." But it started a whole new culture. There is some evidence that the Mimbres culture at that point became the first Katsina culture, very much like what the Hopi and Zuni and some of the other northern pueblos have. There is some evidence that it may have been influenced by the Mayan. We know that the Mayan culture was beginning to disintegrate at around 800 AD. We know that the Mimbres people were trading with Mayans in Mesoamerica for scarlet macaws, other colorful parrots, for cacao, this kind of thing. We know that after about 800 AD, the people in the Mayan culture were beginning to leave their large city-states and disperse throughout more rural areas. So maybe some of them are coming up here. But that also coincided with what ethnobotanists have determined was one of the most productive eras in North American history as far as agriculture is concerned. The period between 900 and 1100, you had all of these great cultures flourishing. Chaco, the Mimbres, the Hohokam were flourishing. Farther east along the Mississippi, you had Cahokia, which became a city-state of 60,000 people. Down around the Gulf Coast in Alabama and Georgia, there was a huge culture there. Down in the southern tip of Florida, there was a huge aquatic culture that developed there. All of them developing at the same time between 900, and they flourished and then began to die out at around 1100 or so. And most of them, there are indications of, primarily through their artwork, of Mesoamerican influence. Now, Mimbres' artwork does not look like Mesoamerican. Cahokia, it does. The ones down along the Gulf of Mexico, they do. Even some of the Chaco has a little bit of Mesoamerican appearance. But with the Mimbres, they had their own distinct styling. But there are evidences in some of the bowls, like this one, that seem to be illustrating elements of the Popol Vuh, which is the Mayan book or tablet of, it's one of the two surviving Mayan tablets. And it happens to be the one telling their origin story. How the gods created the world, but it was filled with monsters, and they put these hero twins on Earth to battle the monsters and make it safe for people. And then after defeating the monsters, then people were created out of corn. That hero twin story is also part of many of the northern Pueblo. It's also part of the Navajo origin story, because the Navajo adopted many of the Pueblo stories. So that is one of the possibilities. This is the Great Kiva, and it would not have been here at the time all of this was built. One interesting fact is after they filled in that 15-foot long entry ramp, this wall was the first wall, we think, the first wall built above ground for any rooms. And it was built directly over the entrance of that entry ramp.
Wow.
And Dr. Patricia Gilman, who led the excavation here in the 70s, said that she believes it was done intentionally as a way of saying that was the old way of doing things. We're not going back there, we're doing things a new way. And it happened so quickly that there was a pit house dug right here. It was about 12 by 15 feet deep, or 12 by 15 feet and about 5 feet deep. They simply filled it back in and started building above ground. The hard work of digging that hole had been completed. So that there was a pit house here that had been completed maybe a few years earlier, and they converted that into what we consider to be a family kiva. Not a kiva ceremonial space for the entire community, but each one of the room blocks seems to have had a kiva space within it or associated with it for that family, or possibly for that clan. And so this was converted from a living space to a kiva space, we think, for this particular room block. Each room block was an individual matriarchal family, so that the ones that are largest obviously have the most daughters or who have been there the longest. Their architecture is unique in that they did not build multi-story constructions the way they did at Chaco at the same time, the way they were doing over in the Hohokam region. They were building single-story using round river cobbles and adobe mud, so that they, unlike the pueblos up north, they were building with sandstone up there that they would shape, and the flat sandstone would sit on top of each other even after the adobe is gone. Here, because they're just unshaped river cobbles, when that adobe erodes out, if the room's not maintained, the weight of the roof will cause the walls to collapse in this way. So all of this rock rubble falls down on the floor. The roof collapses down on top of that. And because the roof is covered with adobe mud, within a year or two, you can hardly tell that there was ever anything there. One of the things you may have noticed when you were out on the trail is that some areas, it wasn't flat. Some areas look higher and then other areas lower. It's those higher areas where there's the rubble from the rooms. And the people here were healthy. On average, they were about an inch taller than surrounding cultures. Their bone density was heavier. They lived here for almost 1,000 years, which is unheard of in the Southwest. Most cultures would develop a community and stay 150 years and then have to leave because resources are depleted. But because they had the river, which ran 365 days a year, they were able to stay here through the early pit house all the way up through the post-classic period, almost 1,000 years. They were long-lived. If they lived past the age of 5, because there was a large infant mortality, they had a life expectancy of 55 or 60 years old. And many of the exhumations are individuals in their 60s and even a few 70s. So that there were no mortal diseases that have been found in any of the excavations. And there is no evidence of warfare. So they were living the life of Eden, really, here. The problem was, as their numbers increased, they were using up all the wood that was in the area. By the time they started building the above ground pueblos, there was not a tree within sight. They were having to go 20 or 30 miles up into the forest just to cut trees. When they were building pit houses require an awful lot of wood. One of the advantages to building the walls of stone is that it uses much less wood. So I think that's one of the reasons why they made that switch. Because all of the vegetation had been cut, the same thing happened here that happened in Silver City. Are you familiar with the Big Ditch Park in Silver City?
No.
It used to be Main Street. It was the main street in town, but because all of the wood around Silver City had been cut, a series of floods in the 1880s and early 1900s washed away Main Street, washed away the buildings along Main Street, and eroded down to bedrock about 70, 75 feet. And now they've made a park out of it. And if you go into Silver City, you'll notice that the curbs are very high because we still get water flooding down through the streets of Silver City. The same thing happened here, where they were only had been about 10 to 15 feet above the floodplain of the river, and they had been planting in the floodplain of the river. Now we're 90 feet above the floodplain. It has eroded down that far.
Wow.
And because the flooding happens during the monsoon season primarily, and they were planting in the floodplain, their gardens would be washed away, their irrigation ditches that they'd so laboriously constructed would be washed away, and the width of the floodplain is getting narrower as it cuts down deeper and deeper. So that is cutting into their production. On top of that, the big game is 30 miles away, where the woods are. On top of that, around 1100, there began to be an extended period of drought. They had lived through droughts of 3, 4, 5 years before because they always had surpluses. Now their surpluses were depleted. They were able to grow less. And so that was cutting into their food supply. And then, as if the gods are not angry enough at us, around 1115, the growing season started getting shorter and colder because of particulate matter in the atmosphere from volcanic activity. Places like Sunset Crater over in Arizona and other active volcanoes. Their growing season got very short. Eventually, this led to a worldwide cooling and 2 years of endless winter in Europe in the 1200s, which led to the Dark Ages. So all of this is being affected all over the world. So all of these things were beginning to happen. People could not sustain themselves here, and they began to move away. They stopped building around 1130. The last building that we're aware of was this room. The wood was cut for that room in 1117. So the room was likely built around 1119 or so. And the process is, with one of those stone axes, if you know what you're doing with it, you can fell a 10 or 12-inch pine tree in about a half an hour. It would take me all day if I ever decided to finish. And then you take another half an hour to cut it to length. And then you take an hour and a half to 2 hours to delimit and debark it. And after 3 hours of work, you leave it in the forest for a year to dry out. And you're going to need about 12 to 15 of those to build a typical room. And so it would be in the forest to 12, 18, and then they have to bring it back here. Meanwhile, they're gathering all the stone that they needed from the river. And it's quite a process. The rooms that are painted in yellow ochre are the ones that we know have been professionally excavated. The ones that are gray, we know that there were rooms there. They may be still unexcavated, they may have been pot hunted. There may still be an estimate that there may be still as many as 25 rooms that have not been damaged for later excavation if new techniques come along. I do want to point out this pottery, because at around 1100, or around 1000 rather, that's when this pottery started. They went from the bold face between the 750 and 1000, they went to the style 1 at around 10,000, or 1,000 rather. And that was like the fine line painting at the top center. They were still doing geometric shapes, but basically geometric shapes around the interior band of the bowls and with finer lines. And then by 1010, they started doing the anthropomorphic, zoomorphic painting. At around 1060 or so, occasionally they would start to add the third color, usually a yellow ochre. The third color, the polychrome paintings, only amounted to about 10% of the paint of the pottery that was done. One unique thing about the paint, the black paint that they were using was unlike the black paint that most cultures used. They were doing, like up at Chaco and other places, they were using bee plant or other plant materials and boiling that down till they got a thick, syrupy consistency, and they would paint with that. And then during the firing, it would carbonize and turn black. The Mimbres people were using an iron manganese ore that they ground to a fine particles, mixed it with a little bit of animal fat and water, and painted with that. Depending on how it fired, it would either come out black on white, or it would come out sort of a reddish brown on white. If it oxidized during the firing or even during the cooling process, then the iron ore would oxidize and it would turn red. If they fired it in a reduction method where they starved it of oxygen, then it would be black. And then there was some artist who learned how to control it in such a way. There were many pots like this where you see two animals in opposition. One will be black, one will be red. And that is something that contemporary potters who do reproductions of Mimbres pottery are still trying to figure out how they did it. So it's all the same paint here, here, and there. But when the people moved away from here, well, let me back up a little bit. Talk a little bit more about the hippie aspect of it. obviously their pottery was unique. Nobody else was doing this. It got freely traded between one pueblo and another. Most of the pottery was done between the Nan Ranch, which is about 15 miles south of here, north, because farther south there was even less wood. And it would be done in these pueblos along here, but it would be traded to all of the Mimbres pueblos. But it did not get traded outside of the region. We find pottery from other pueblos and other cultures in Mimbres sites. We found a choco pot, actually a canteen, here at this site. But you do not find Mimbres pottery in their sites. We don't know if that's because it was forbidden to trade it outside of the culture, or if those other cultures just did not want this stuff. It may very well have been that they believed, like modern day Islam, that to depict animals and people is sacrilege. So they don't want that evil stuff in their house, whereas the Mimbres people thought it was beautiful. And it was part of their ceremonial life as well as being utilitarian. In addition to their pottery being unique, their architecture was unique. You do not find any two room blocks that are built alike. You do not find any two Mimbres pueblos that are laid out alike. It's as if each family had their own way of doing things, and everyone in the family followed whatever grandma did. Even back earlier during the pit house period, Dr. Barb Roth from University of Nevada, Las Vegas, who excavated several pit house sites, found that they would be in clusters. This cluster over here, all of the pit houses would be alike. And then this cluster over here, those pit houses would be alike, but they would be different from over here. For example, you might go down the entry ramp over here, and the entry ramp is actually facing to the south. And when you got to the bottom of the entry ramp, the hearth is right at the bottom of the entry ramp, and on the right side of the hearth, there would be a bowl buried in the floor. Everyone over here did the same thing. Then over in this cluster, the entry ramp is all facing east. And you go down the entry ramp to the hearth, and there's no bowl on the right side of the hearth, but there's a jar or an Oya buried in the floor on the left side of the hearth. So it seems to be that whatever the originator of that particular family grouping, whatever they did is the way everyone else had to do it. I sort of joke, we're the only Mimbres pueblo that I'm aware of that has a 3-car garage. Those 3 rooms were built like every other room, with stone and adobe walls, roofed like every other room, but they did not have a south-facing wall. They may have been used for for workspaces, shaded and cool in the summer, sheltered and warm in the winter. Or one Native American girl offered the concept of perhaps they were used as early greenhouses during that period of time when, after 1115, when things started to get cool. Maybe they were starting plants in those south-facing rooms to be transplanted later after the frost. We have no way of knowing. The third thing that was unique was in their burials. And that has become part of the mystique of the Mimbres people. Majority of the burials were under the floors of the rooms that people continued to live in. 60 to 70% of those burials are women or children. We think that they were matriarchal, so that makes sense. It's her house, you know, that's who gets buried there. But that still leaves 30 to 40% adult males can be buried in the rooms. There are burials that are done outside of the rooms, which are mostly adult males, but women and children have been found in those contexts as well. Most of the burials, well, the early concept of a Mimbres burial was, it was actually a drawing of a adolescent male buried in the flex position, squat, upright with a bowl over his head, in a hole under the floor. So people thought that's the way Mimbres people were buried. They were often buried in the flex position, but not very often upright. More often they were laying down, either on one side or the other, or on their back. There seems to be no particular orientation for the head, the way there is in many cultures. They were buried with a bowl that might be perhaps over his head, over their face, but not necessarily. There are burials that have the bowl, that have the kill holes in them, the hole that was punctured ceremonially at the time of the burial, or they may be intact holes. The kill hole has been explained by contemporary Pueblans in two different ways. One is everything has a living spirit. So if you're going to bury that bowl, it should not be living. It should be buried, it should be killed. The other explanation is that the bowl represents the sky dome, and the hole is punctured to allow the spirit of the departed individual to pass through the sky dome to the afterlife. And I'm not convinced that either one of those is the true explanation, because Pueblans are very secretive about their religious practices. Not every burial has a bowl with them. Most do, not everyone does. Some of the burials are actually laid out full length rather than being in the flex position. And again, oriented to the south, east, all different directions, maybe laying on the side or on their back. And then another variant is that they did cremations. And the cremated ashes and bone fragments would be scooped up, placed in a bowl, covered with another bowl, and that would be buried. So most cultures have a standardized burial practice. The Mimbres people evidently did not. So those are three of the really major ways that these people differed from many of the other cultures. Architecturally, too, during this time period, from about 1000, Chaco was building rooms with surface doorways. The Mimbres people were using hatches in the roof as a means of entry. And you go down the ladder into a central room, and there may be a small hearth under the ladder, because that's the only chimney space. There may be one or two surface doorways into adjoining rooms, used for storage or sleeping or whatever, but that would be your apartment. If you wanted to visit your daughter, you would climb the ladder, walk across the roof, go down her ladder. She would have a similar setup. The archaeologists were actually surprised when they started to excavate these two rooms in the 1970s, because they found that those two rooms each had a surface doorway. We're pretty sure that those rooms were built very late because of their location, probably after 1100. And each of those two rooms had unique features about them. The one on the west side had 3 large pieces of flagstone that had been finely fitted together, 2 of them in the corners like this, embedded into the adobe wall, and then the third one as a lid. The room on the east side, underneath the adobe floor, it had a finely fitted flagstone floor. We have no idea why. We joke, Grandma laid a flagstone floor in her kitchen, but that room was not evidently a habitation room. There was no hearth or anything in it. Possibly a storage room. I personally don't think it was a food storage room, because a hatch in the roof would have been far more secure against, invasion of critters than a surface doorway. Some speculation is that because of its locale, it was a place for preparation for ceremonies to be held here in the plaza areas. The dancers could come out and onto the plaza.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, you can see what I mean about somebody who enjoys what they're doing. I know if we stayed another hour, Bill would have taken us to more rooms and explained more things. Just wanted to share. It was fantastic. And to us, it was just a fortunate occurrence. The people that were working there that day, Linda and Bill, they may do it once a month. We just happened to hit the day where they were working. Not one other person came to visit the museum, so we basically got a private tour. So I hope you found it educational. You learned stuff. I know I learned. I never even heard of the Mimbres before we went to this museum. But as I said, hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something. If you like my content, more people subscribe. Give me thumbs up if they enjoyed it. Hit notification bell. Make comments. It just inspires me to make more videos. It's always a little depressing to make a video that nobody watches. So if you'd be kind enough, subscribe, comment. I'd appreciate it. And have yourself a blessed day. Thank you for watching.